The research interrogated whether the president's 1.6 million rand achieved or failed to advance gender justice. It also looked at the implementation of the emergency response action plans between October 2019 and March 2020. This conversation segues nicely into both the conversation we've just had with the Minister of Justice and the one we're going to have with Irene Chanley later on gender-based violence and femicide. Now, to talk to us, Advocate Brenda Madumise, who is a director at Wise4Africa, joins us via Zoom. A very good morning to you. I don't know if you had a chance to listen in on the conversation we were having with the minister just now. Your thoughts?
Morning, Desiree. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear the minister. I could hear you. I couldn't hear the minister. I would have loved to hear what he had to say about the report card or even the 1.6 billion that the president announced.
Yeah, he went into talking about how initiatives like the Tutuzela care centers are really working out. But maybe let's talk about your work. Remind our viewers what the emergency response action plans that you are judging the national government against are.
So it arises out of the UNN's matter in the Western Cape at UCT student when the president was attending World Economic Forum in Cape Town. The student protested and marched through the convention center in Cape Town, and the president came out and announced that he would like to introduce new emergency measures to respond to gender-based violence. At the time when he made that announcement, there was an interim steering committee on gender-based violence and femicide, which I was part of. And we were then given the responsibility to come up with an emergency response action plan that can address gender-based violence in the just in the short term. And it was a 6-month period that we're looking at from October up until the 31st of March 2020. So October 2019 to October 2020. And you recall that the interim steering committee was made up of civil society and government and other players, development funders and other players. Government departments were then given the responsibility to look at what from their budget, once the president announced in Parliament that he's allocating 1.6 billion towards gender-based violence for the emergency response action plan, departments then needed to go back to their respective departments to look at what interventions they can come up with immediately within that period and reprioritize their budget. And we need to emphasize that this was not new money. It was not money that was being announced by the president because there is 1.6 billion sitting somewhere. No, this was money that departments were expected to look at their existing budget and reprioritize and channel those funds towards GBV programs that they would have identified in the emergency response action plan. So the emergency response action plan ranged from the South African Police Service looking at what are the quickest things that they can do within 6 months, what Department of Justice can do, health, labor, education, GCIS, all of them. And if I give an example, the police looked at dealing with the backlog of DNA cases, right? Yeah. Still today, that has not been achieved. I mean, they had wanted to reduce that number from 6,000 that they were sitting at to something like 1,000. We are still sitting at that 6,000 because no resources have been plowed back into the labs that are dealing with rape DNA tests, so that the rape cases that are still sitting and not being dealt with by the courts cannot be dealt by the courts because that the DNA is still stuck in the labs.
Yeah,
there's supposed to be a lab that is built in the Eastern Cape. If you look at the Eastern Cape, if there's a rape case in the Eastern Cape, the DNA is taken from Eastern Cape by road, it gets into a car, by road is taken to the Western Cape in Cape Town. That process can contaminate that evidence. by the way. So the people in the Eastern Cape are held ransom because they don't have a lab that can process the DNA. They had agreed, the police, that they will then set up a new lab for the Eastern Cape to address the need of the Eastern Cape. That has not happened. So the number of things that they had identified, interventions that they had identified, and they have not done them. There was some progress in other areas, but most of all, and you look at the report, we gave them an F, precisely because they did not achieve what they had set out to achieve with that 1.6 billion that they themselves said they can do within the 6 months.
Were there any areas where there was some sort of progress?
So the progress in this manner, the 3 pieces of legislation that are before Parliament that Department of Justice said they will work on. So those 3 pieces of legislation, one on the domestic violence amendment and the bail amendments that were being proposed, and the National Sex Offenders Register that we wanted to expand and include all sex offenders and make it public. All those 3 bills were done, and before Parliament, we are waiting for Parliament to conclude that process. So that was some step that was positive. But as we say in the report, in our report card, significant progress still is needed to move those 3 bills so that we can get certainty and we can start to implement the new amendments and implement the new changes.
So your report card also... Your report card also takes into consideration. Your report card also takes into consideration that some of the pledged support had to be redirected to the fight against COVID-19. To what extent did the COVID-19 outbreak derail or exacerbate the fight against gender-based violence and femicide?
We make the point in our report card, Desiree, that COVID cannot be used as an excuse in this instance, for the simple reason that this work commenced before COVID. So the resources were set out way before March, when we went on a hard lockdown, and the resources started to be utilized towards COVID. By the time COVID started and government departments were supposed to redirect the monies towards COVID, that money was supposed to have been expended on the interventions that had been identified on the emergency response action plan, right? So, and the response action plan was coming to an end of March 2020. So by the time we started to engage and really deal with COVID as a country, the work of the emergency response action plan and the interventions were supposed to be concluded, and the money would have been expended accordingly. So we can't use COVID as an excuse that things did not happen. If there were things that were recurring, possibly, then they need to explain to us then how did COVID affect the implementation of some of the things that they should have completed within the 6 months that was identified.
In light of all of this, are you encouraged by the initiative launched by the private sector yesterday alongside the president and their fundraising effort?
We are encouraged because the implementation of the National Strategic Plan requires almost all of us to play a part, right? So private sector has been slagging for the longest of time. They have not been making themselves available on policy discussions around GBV and Femicide, around gender equality, around discrimination in the workplace, conscious and unconscious bias. So it's a welcome effort from their part now to say, we understand that this scourge is an emergency, is a crisis, is a pandemic. We also now have to put resources to make sure that we deal with it, and we deal with it effectively. But also to understand that almost all these companies and as private sectors, they are individuals. They operate in a society as leaders in their respective communities. They need to engage with society at all levels, not just as corporate South Africa. As corporate South Africa, as they build their industries around communities, they need to get involved in matters such as gender-based violence and femicide because they want to have a productive workforce. So we welcome that they are now coming up and stepping up and playing a role alongside all other South Africans to ensure that we rid South Africa of this toxic masculinity and patriarchy that continues to subjugate women and lead to violence against women.
So at a time when most efforts are directed at the fight against COVID-19 and the economic recovery plan of the country, how do you, people such as yourself, plan to ensure that your plight is not put in the back burner?
Oh, on a daily basis, Desiree, we are at it. So that people don't think that you can then push gender-based violence into a corner and not deal with it. And the one of the ways in which we deal with this to ensure that it stays topical and on top of the agenda is that we connect it to almost everything else that is going on in the country. So when you talk COVID, you can't talk COVID in isolation of the reality of many women in the country who are now facing a double whammy, in the sense that they're dealing with violence, they're also dealing with COVID, they're dealing with unemployment, they're dealing with inequality. So we link and integrate all of these things to demonstrate the importance of gender-based violence in almost in everything that you are doing.
Yeah.
You can't separate it from education. You can't separate it from the economy. You can't separate it from transport.
Brenda,
that if I get into a taxi, I might have
quick one, I have to let you go.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the president's response to gender-based violence, are you satisfied with that? And just finally give us details in terms of how the public can interact with your report card and where it's accessible.
I think the president hits the right notes most of the time. What is lacking is once he hit that note, is that almost everyone who is in his cabinet, in his administration, needs to respond to that note with seriousness and swiftness. And that's what has been lacking, that the responsiveness of and the seriousness in which we want gender-based violence to be addressed is lacking. And so President says the right things, but that right tone is not resonating and replicating in his administration, and that's what he needs to work on, to ensure that once he steps up and talks about 1.6 billion emergency response action, everyone needs to understand that it's an emergency and people must treat it as an emergency and act quickly and swiftly, because it is an emergency and it's urgent, right? So and that's what we want to emphasize, and the report card deals with that. If those South Africans who wish to interact with our report, it's on our website, Wise4Africa. It's on our Facebook page, which is Wise4Africa. People can access it.
Thanks for your thoughts this morning.
Thank you.
Advocate Brenda Madumise is a director for Wise4Africa. Go through to their website and just look at that very interesting report card and the pillars that they look at in terms of delivery, where there has been delivery and where the government has still been found wanting. Now, the National